Lee Jones is a senior academic at the Queen Mary University of London, specializing in international politics. He joins me now from London. Lee, good to have you on the show. When you look at this report, the inability of the World Health Organization to definitively sort of conclude where or how this virus began. I mean, it looks like these tensions are likely to rise over how the pandemic began.
Yeah, it's not that surprising. I mean, the investigation was delayed by nearly a whole year, and then the team, when it was in China, did not have full access to the original data. They had to rely on Chinese scientists' own conclusions and summaries, and the assurances of lab workers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that basically didn't originate with them. So they've had limited access to data, and therefore it's not too surprising that basically the story that they've come up with is reinforcing the dominant theory about where the virus came from, which is that it's a zoonotic disease originating probably in bats, although they suggest it's hopped through an intermediary species into the human population. And it certainly circulated in the Huanan wet market in Wuhan, but it's not quite clear whether it really originated in the wet market, because not all of the original infections, the earliest infections, could be traced to the wet market. So there's still a possibility that maybe it circulated on farms before it arrived in the market and then circulated there. But the basic story coming out of this report is more or less what scientists had thought, most scientists had thought at least, for the past year.
Yeah, let me ask you this. You mentioned a limited access by this group of scientists that went over to Wuhan. I mean, when you look at the report, even the chief of the World Health Organization is calling for deeper probe into this sort of lab leak theory. How likely is it, do you think, that full access will be given to possibly a follow-up expedition?
Well, I think the Chinese government made a decision, which is to restrict access to information and also to delay the World Health Organization team coming. And this is not new. The Chinese have been quite selective about what information they release and when, right from the very start of the pandemic. So it seems to me they've made a decision, and I don't see why they would change that. In fact, if anything, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China has just been quite bullish about it and said, well, we've been open, let's have the same openness and transparency from the American side, propagating this theory that maybe COVID-19 emerged in virological labs in the United States, which I think is basically baseless. But it shows that the Chinese have been very bullish all the way through this and have tried to propagate various very unlikely theories that the virus originated outside of China in order to deflect blame from China, obviously from this devastating pandemic.
Let me expand sort of the implications of this. I mean, some of the countries that were part of this sort of long delayed scientific expedition to Wuhan, interestingly, is also a group of countries that are sort of calling out China when it comes to human rights abuses, especially against the Uyghur Muslim minority, and also what's going on in Hong Kong. Surprising?
Well, it's not too surprising, really. There is an emerging Cold War, if you like, between various Western powers and China, and that has really exacerbated over the last few years. And I think the pandemic inevitably gets caught up in that. And from the very beginning, the question about whether the World Health Organization would declare a health emergency of international concern that would trigger various containment measures, that was very much bound up in the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. And so I think everything basically from now on, everything to do with China is always going to be mediated through this growing tension between the West and China. And the view that the Chinese are not playing by the rules, they're not being transparent, they're not being open. And the Chinese have shifted from a position that might have been somewhat defensive, trying to show that they are cooperating, trying to show that they're a good member of the international community, now towards what's called wolf warrior diplomacy, where they're very aggressive in trying to rebut attacks and criticisms on China, to the point of putting individual sanctions on scholars and institutions that have talked about the human rights abuses in Xinjiang province, for example, and also trying to shift blame for the origins of the COVID pandemic onto the United States, as I mentioned. So there is a very kind of aggressive pushback against anybody that would dare to criticize China these days.
Okay. Lee Jones, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for coming on the NewsHour. I do appreciate your analysis.